It would seem that if anything goes wrong with South African cricket right now, that it must be Temba Bavuma's fault. The man who wasn't taken in his own T20 draft, embarrassing Cricket South Africa. The man who tried to stand down from his position with the T20 team during the 2021 World Cup. And the man who looked like he was doing the same thing in the 2022 event as the Dutch sent them home. And again, when South Africa couldn't make any runs against Australia, surely it must be Temba Bavuma's fault again. In fact, even when he made runs, he managed to run out his teammates. He's become such a convenient scapegoat for everything that is wrong with South African cricket. And there are racial reasons for this, and quota reasons for this, and the fact he doesn't make 100 reasons for this. I suppose that would make them 99 reasons, but anyway. But the truth is right now that South African test batting is utterly horrendous. That's an undeniable fact, and it was clear before 2022. But playing England and Australia in Big Martins certainly exposed the truth a lot more. Nothing makes people notice your flaws like playing against the big three teams away from home. Until recently, I was being consistently told that I was underrating South Africa, not being told that anymore. That narrative has been dismissed about as quickly as their batters were. Some of the reason people were still thinking they're a good team is because their bowlers were absolutely fantastic. Their attack has been the third best in tests over the last 5 years by average. And yet in that same time, they are winning less than half of their tests. That's not an accident. And the reason is that even though they have such great bowling, their batting is actually losing wickets faster than they can take them. They have a negative 2-run rating for every wicket they take. They're actually lucky to have as good an overall record as they do. You can see that they are some distance away from the best teams in the game. And so what you have with them is the best bowling team and the second worst when it comes to batting. That is so incredibly low. I knew that they had been bad, but even I was shocked to see them all the way down here. This is the home of Faulkner, the Norses, Mitchell, Pollock, Richards, the Kirstens, De Villiers, Amla and Callis. I mean, the batting talent that has come out of South Africa generation after generation is extraordinary. And you can just see how far they have slipped. In the first few years of the decade, they were either on average or sometimes well in front of it. Since 2012, they've only scored more than the average once. And if you need it to be clearer, they used to be almost 5 runs ahead of the global average. Since the start of 2013, they have been under it by 2 runs. That's an incredible turnaround, and it would be hard to blame that on, let's say, I don't know, Temba Bavuma. So there's absolutely no doubt that they are batting horribly, and so the obvious thought there is that they are horrible batters. But there's always something you have to check when it comes to South Africa. Remember, this is a tricky era to face seam bowling. Some may call it a pace-playing pandemic. And obviously in South Africa, there's a lot of seam delivered. However, in the last few years of South Africa, they've actually been facing a lot more spin at home and bowling a lot more of it as well. Many locals believe that the pitches have actually changed because of global warming, and so teams are actually starting to pick frontline spinners, not just the old-fashioned South African spinner who would rotate the bowler. And of course, the opposition have joined in by using their spinners as well. It's actually shocking to see them in this place in the list, and also not a surprise that the 2 teams using Dukes at home are way up top. Of course, bowling seam is still doing very well in South Africa, and it's as good as anywhere outside the West Indies. And so averaging 24 runs at wicket over a long period is insanity. And it's not just there. India and Australia shouldn't have batting average of sub 30 against pace bowling in their nations either. So we know that times have changed. But for South Africa, it does show that they are pretty much as bad as we think. Because while facing pace is really tough right now, at home they're actually facing less of it than they were 6 years ago. And so while their numbers might look extraordinarily low, it's not just because they're playing on South African pitches. You might have noticed before that the trend starts in 2013. That may not be a coincidence, as that was also the last year of Jarrod's Callis. It was essentially robbing South Africa of their great advantage in modern times. A top 4 batter who could deliver 20 overs of mid-level quality seam, and sometimes better than that. If you look at his record from 1999 and 2012, he averaged 44 and above every year except for 1. And then in 2013, Father Time caught him out, and that was the first year that South Africa had their bad batting form. That was the end of his career. It means that in every test from 1997 until 2013, South Africa had an automatic 6 batters and 5 bowlers. That is the dream. No need for part-timers or even handy number 8s. The team was perfectly balanced. And for much of that time, they also had Brian McMillan, Lance Klusener and Sean Pollock. By 2014, they had no frontline all-rounders, so that meant that they had to make a big decision almost every match. But one good thing did happen to them around that period. They lost an all-time great all-rounder, and they picked up another fantastic option, even if it wasn't the same kind of all-rounder or even on that level. Quinton de Kock was pretty damn good, and while he didn't replace Kellis in the top order, he did become a specialist batter after proving himself over a long period of time as a number 7. So just by moving into the top 6, he allowed them to try someone else at number 7. But what he really gives them is flexibility. So for more than half of his career, he was batting at number 7 himself. Except by the end, he was making so many runs, there was just no point keeping him down there. So by February 2019, QDK is a number 6 or higher, and so we see that South Africa now has a chance to fit another all-rounder in at number 7 on a more permanent basis. And so that the player that South Africa used the most amount of times after that point was Wiaan Mulder. He's a decent first-class batter where he averages 35. But clearly they wanted his bowling as well, where he takes wickets at just under the average of 30. It's on quite low usage, taking only 2.3 wickets a game, but it's still there. And in test matches, his bowling was pretty much as advertised. He took 16 wickets at 26 over 11 matches. But he never passed 36 with the bat and averaged 14. That was really their main attempt to fix that spot with an all-rounder, other than a couple of spinners that they tried in special circumstances. But eventually they'd get really funky. They'd move on from all-rounders and just start using bowlers there. Vernon Philander gets some time there. Simon Harmer as well. And then of course recently it's been Marco Jansen. And I get it. The players they picked for all-round skills didn't really make any runs at all. Why not just bump up a handy number 8? But remember, as we talked about before, by 2019, South Africa's batting was already pretty bad, while their bowling was obviously magnificent. And so at this point, they're actually deciding to give themselves an extra bowler and lose an extra batter. And they have 3 of the fastest striking bowlers in the last 5 years. Now this is a pretty consistent trend with South African bowlers because of their home pitches. But if these 3 can take wickets at this pace, and Maharaj can bowl all day, why do they need that 5th bowler so much? Especially when we know that they need a 7th batter. And they've tried this a lot. As good as their 5 bowlers are, they still can't make enough runs to balance their books, which is why they have a negative net average. With this bowling lineup, they should be able to win more. But while bowlers are more important in tests than batters, even they can't defend an average score of 240 that often. So we have talked in general about the batting, but let us look at the current lot in depth for a moment. This is a list of the players who are available and have played tests over the last couple of years. So to start with, we have Elgar, who is obviously pretty well known. After 49 tests, he was averaging 42.6. That would have had him 2 runs under Alistair Cook's record had he stayed there. But unlike Cook, he had to bat through the pace-playing pandemic, which he actually did well for a couple of whiles. In 2 years, he managed a 40-plus average. But eventually there was a drop there as well. And his last 33 tests, which is pretty much his last 5 years, showed that he just isn't the player he was before. Next is Cyril Ewe. 10 tests into his career, he has really struggled to make, well, any runs at all. And he has played professional cricket for a very long time. When you look at his record through all these seasons, you see a real solid pro. But I'm not sure I'm looking here at a test player. It is possible that what happened is that he had a late career surge and he got it all right. And you can see that in 2020 and 2021, he strings together 2 of his best 3 years. And so of course he is picked by South Africa. But when you look at his whole career, he's still someone not averaging 40 in the first class game. And so while he is underperforming tests so far, it's hard to think that he's ever going to average much more than 35 at the top level unless everything falls his way. Heinrich Klaassen has only played 2 tests, so his record there doesn't matter that much yet. But you can see he's very high up when it comes to first class average, and that's incredibly promising. But he's over 30, usually bats further down the order, and he also just hasn't played that much first class cricket in the last couple of years. And it sort of tells you everything about South African cricket that he was suddenly first drop in Australia. Their problem is, where are they going to fit him into this batting order? Does that make sense? And also, is he going to have enough time to play tests and first class cricket to actually work on his game to get to the level that they would want him to be anyway? This brings us to Kaya Zondo, who can paint some very pretty pictures with his drive. He certainly passes the eye test easy enough. Zondo was picked after a late career purple bit of form where he averaged 73 in 2020 and 21. Largely on the back of an unbeaten 200 and a bunch of 40s and 50s. This is his 16th professional year and he averages low 30 in first class cricket. He's clearly another solid pro, but throwing him in and expecting him to average much more than 35 is kind of hoping that miracles will happen. Kyle Variana has a great first class average, but it hasn't quite worked so far in tests. He's young and I think we've seen enough flashes. But I don't know what he will end up doing, but I think he'll certainly end up with a far better record than he has now. And he's the most exciting of the players on this list because he is the only one yet to reach his prime batting years. His 25 years pops out here because everyone else is hovering around 30 or perhaps even looking back on it from a distance. Oh, and we should just pause back here for a moment because this is a list of batters that they have tried so far. And I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on South African domestic players, but I have a bunch of names that I thought were worth looking at just for this list. Jarrod Brevis has not actually played a first-class match, but him and Tristan Stubbs have already talked about how they want to play Test cricket, and I can't see anything in his game that suggests he won't be at least a very good red ball player. But we'll just have a look at Tristan Stubbs. 8 matches is not a lot, but he's not far off averaging 50 in them. Ryan Rickleton is 26 and he's averaging over 50 in first-class cricket and has only played 3 tests, and he seemed to miss Australia through some weird disagreement over injuries with Cricket South Africa. What about one of their many Milans, Janneman? He's a white ball player and averages 48 in red ball cricket. Then you've got Dazorzi, who probably looks out of place here when it's on average, but he's only 25, and in the last 3 years he's been averaging 56, including big runs for South Africa A. And then you have Jonathan Bird. 6 matches in, he has 2 first-class hundreds, and you can put Jordan Herman there as well, who's only played 8 games with a couple of hundreds as well. Now, I'm not a huge fan of throwing in youngsters just because everyone else sucks. So Brevis, Stubbs, Herman, and Bird might just need some more games and more times to develop. But Rickleton is certainly worth looking at far more often than he has played. Milan would seemingly be worth a shot, and Dazorzi is certainly something I would be developing based on the last couple of years. The point is that there does not seem to be a lack of batting talent in South Africa. Just runs at the test level. So where were we? Rassie van der Dussen. He's obviously still around the traps. And in test cricket, it hasn't gone well yet. We know this was a late blooming player who's done everything he can to get the most out of himself. And you can see here how late it was that he actually brought everything together. And it was 2019, as you'd be unsurprised having a look at this, when South Africa finally took a chance on him. And just then, he really hasn't made any runs. That does seem to be a bit of a theme. We've talked about players earlier on the list who did something similar, and now we've also got Keegan Peterson, who has impressed a lot of people since coming into the game by looking very composed and like he knows what he's doing. But you can see, very similar to Rassie, he had 2 sensational years, South Africa picked him, and he has struggled since. He's not been horrible in tests, but he's certainly not been incredible either. Then you have Aiden Markram. I think he's the biggest disappointment. I was following him from a very, very young age, and I expected by this stage in his career for him to be a legit test player and probably a captain. Neither of those things have happened. His first-class numbers are incredible, but in 33 tests he averages 34. You'd certainly argue that he is better than that. But the real reason it's so low is because away from home he's been non-existent. Pakistan is the only country he's made any runs at all other than at home, and his away record is from only 12 matches. So he hasn't had a lot of time to work it out, but even so, this is incredibly low. Oh, and this reminds me, before we had a look at whether playing at home was ruining the South Africans' overall batting averages, which is a very good question because historically it is harder to bat in South Africa than other places. But the one thing I didn't show you is probably what you wanted me to at the time, which was the away averages. And you can see that South Africa are absolutely horrendous when they bat away from home. Again, I knew they were bad, but I was not expecting them to have the worst record of any test nation away in the last 3 years. This absolutely stinks. But let's go back to our fellas again. Here we have Thunus de Bruyn, who averages almost 50 in first-class cricket outside of test matches, and in 13 big boy matches, he's averaged less than 20. There has to be luck in a number being that bad, but in their case, it's an unlucky 13. Everyone on this list has ordinary batting numbers. The only batters in this group that would be in high demand would be Dean Elgar and maybe Kyle Verreynne. Even if he hasn't quite proved it yet, he's young and he can bat. Oh, and on that young thing, let's just throw this up again. Remember that many of these players were picked around their peak batting age. They were picked when they're in the best form of their life. And some of them are still in their peak batting ages, and they're just not making any runs at all. And I just want to show you this. This is basically taking their first class average and having a look at how much less they average in test cricket. Obviously, you expect players to average more in first class than test. Although, with some of these players being picked around their prime, it should have been pretty much 50-50. So yes, we expect drop-off here, but every player has a drop-off here. In fact, the only player with what I would say is a normal mark is Dean Elgar. But then there is one player who's probably punching above his weight, and that's Temba Bavuma. Which is obviously hilarious because so many fans seem to think that he is the problem. Although, as we've pointed out, he does get blamed for everything in South African cricket, whether he's involved or not. But of course, there is something quite inconvenient about all this. Not only does he punch above his weight in average, Temba Bavuma has the best batting average for South Africa in the last 2 years of Test cricket. The second best is a retired player. And the best is the captain, Elgar, who averages 11 runs less than Bavuma does. And if you follow my work, you'll know that I had Bavuma in the shortlist for the Most Improved Test Player Award. Obviously, he's not had a perfect situation. Part of the reason that he was the most improved is because of how bad he was before. And he's still not making hundreds, which is something that's bothering him as well. But the man is still scoring more than anyone else in South Africa. So what does that say? When the guy you blame has ended up outperforming everyone else? That seems like the worst possible situation. And he's not a great player, and no one would argue that. And obviously he still struggles. But as we sit here, it's also true that in this absolute cesspool that is current South African batting, Temba Bavuma is the best they've had in the last 2 years. And if that is the case, the real question should be, how on earth has South African batting got this bad?